we already have a group of indigenous instructors here in the US, not only for Quechua, but for Aymara, for Nahuatl, for all of them. So we can share. I think that is the first step here, like create a community here in the US with instructors that are already here. And that is also the community heart, right? That is Quechua.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language,
Elvia Andía follows up on her talk about teaching indigenous language classes and her own experience teaching Quechua.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. We are excited to have Elvia Andía with us today. Professor Andía is Quechua Lecturer at The Ohio State University.
She gave a talk as part of our monthly LRC speaker series on designing indigenous language classes to promote spoken proficiency, and we will extend our conversation about best practices today.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Elvia.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be here, and thank you so much for having me here, guys.
Well, we're very happy to have you. We thought we could kick things off by having you talk a little bit about your background in education and in languages.
Right. So I have a degree in applied linguistics to language teaching back in Bolivia. I have a master's degree in higher education, and my focus on my work back in Bolivia was to search about the linguistic policies for indigenous language that are used in the higher education. So I work with the indigenous universities there, and I am teaching Quechua for about 12 years. I am a native speaker of the language. I am in the US for 5 years. Ohio State University invited me for teaching Quechua here 5 years ago.
That's wonderful. And you are the only nationally certified rater for Quechua in the U.S.
Yes, that is very nice news, and it was an achieve, right, for not only for Quechua, but it is a good example what we can do with indigenous languages around the world.
Yeah, so that's actually something we do want to talk a little bit more about today. But first off, I want to remind our listeners, and we did mention this in our first episode, but we are so excited that we are now offering Quechua again at Cornell after a long hiatus. And Elvia, as you noted in your talk, many less commonly taught languages, and the indigenous languages in particular, face a lack of material for language instruction. And so sometimes it's difficult to identify different sources of input for the students in these indigenous languages. So in your talk, you offered some best practices in designing indigenous language classes that are rooted in the ACTFL standards. Can you please give our listeners a very brief digest of what you talked about, some of these best practices for designing materials?
Yes. So during my training to become an OPI tester, I learned lots of things from my mentor, right? And she was the great mentor that I could have. Mm-hmm. And also about how ACTFL, right, organized the language functions for each level of the language. So ACTFL presents clearly language functions descriptors. So I use them to organize the learning goals for my classes. Yeah. Because I think that if I do that, so I can prepare my plan, my lesson plan for every day, and my materials and all of that, looking for what they are looking for at the end of the semester, at the end of the course. So we know clearly what has to be the product at the end of the end of the instruction. So based on them, I created materials according to the level and with a proper cultural knowledge, right, with aspects from my culture that are properly placed in the materials that I designed. I designed rubrics for each skill and level. So I am evaluating the language proficiency based on what the students can do at each level. Mm-hmm. I am preparing materials for each level, and I'm not jumping other levels. I'm not touching other levels. And I'm helping the students to achieve that. And in my classes, I provide many language practice situation or opportunities for my students so they can use Quechua in different tasks.
Well, so you talked about the oral proficiency interview and the disconnect between many prompts that are relevant for more commonly taught languages. Can you expand a bit on that and the challenges Indigenous languages face with standardized interviews like the OPI?
ACFL has these standards for each level, right? So
Yeah.
for beginning, for novice to intermediate, they are the descriptors and also the prompts that they have. You can just change them easily because the product is like how the students, can solve these familiar situations, can use the language in a very, basic situation or context, right? But when you jump, when you go further, you go to advanced level, superior level, then you find the aspects that the standards, are calling for another elements or another description that do not apply to Indigenous people.
Mhm.
Right? Some they are calling like this speaker is going to be able to communicate with a well-educated speaker of Quechua, right? So I think that these descriptors, these standards, are not adequate for Quechua or for any Indigenous language.
Mhm.
But at any point, right, I'm saying that we don't have, Indigenous people don't have, well prepared speakers, professionals, right, that has these degrees and everything. So I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that maybe the students who are learning the Quechua are not learning a language to communicate with the real Quechuas that are in the community, that are in the, in the areas where they want to do the research,
Yeah.
where they want to visit. So they are learning Quechuas to speak with a professor that also learns Quechua, also knows Quechua. So these standards sometimes are not connected with the cultural things in Quechua or for another Indigenous community.
Yeah. So, what are some solutions that you can think of to make interview protocols like the OPI more applicable for Indigenous languages? Like, are you maybe working on a set of different prompts for these higher levels of proficiency to adequately take into account the cultural context of the Indigenous culture? Are there some things that you have in mind or that you maybe are already working on?
I think that when not only ACFO but other institutions that designed these standards for
Yeah.
oral proficiency, they didn't consider Indigenous language really, right? Not because they are
Sure.
ignoring them or something, but there was not some native speaker of Indigenous language as part of the team that were building these standards or these criteria, because if we could have someone that can, let them know what involves to speak an Indigenous language, what important elements from our culture has to be when someone is using our language, then they are going to realize that we can say a lot of things. We can talk about many, many things. We are not saying that we are not able to talk about the topics that they want
Sure.
to evaluate, but the things that maybe it's important for us also as we speak, this background, this cultural background is going to be always when we are speaking. We always are going to make reference to our grandparents, to our history, to our examples of life and everything. And sometimes these standards, right, are so straight, so you cannot go escape to the rule. But sometimes with Indigenous languages, you have to redesign them or maybe rewrite the standard and consider
Mhm.
exceptions, right? Consider exceptions. So we are going to evaluate Quechuas or Indigenous language. So we are going to consider advanced or superior or distinguished levels, also including these aspects from their cultural background. And working with that, only I'm working in my classes. So for those levels, I am using the examples or the standard from not only for ACFL, but from others. And, creating these situations, communicative situation for my students.
Mhm.
Yes, complicated situation where they can explain things, narrate things, give their opinion and everything, but based on what they are going to face, the
Yeah.
reality.
So how do you tie cultural background and native speakers into your teaching? What are some strategies for instructors of Indigenous languages to connect with native speakers?
Okay, I think that the best resource for creating materials is the instructor,
Mhm.
right? Is the instructor, and more if the instructor is a native speaker.
Yeah.
So once you have that for Indigenous language, so the instructor can create materials, create readings, create situations, create everything because he or she has the language with him or with her, right? So and then the instructor, right? The instructor can record, herself, himself, write tests, design communicative activities, and more. With a proper cultural approach, I think that they can create like wonderful materials,
Mhm.
right? And the best option is to create materials that you, as an Indigenous instructor, right, as an Indigenous instructor, are happy with. I'm happy with this text. I'm happy how this text talks about family. I'm happy how they represent the community
Mhm.
here.
Mhm.
And also, as a native speaker, you know what aspects are challenging the community, so you can talk and discuss that to your students, and also prepare them. Right? I
Yeah.
always talk to them like, you are going to face different things when you visit an indigenous
Sure.
community. So sometimes it's going to be very challenging for you when you arrive and visit a faraway community with maybe where they do not have the basic elements that maybe you are used to, like running water, like, everyday transportation and
Mhm.
internet, 5G, or, all of that maybe you are not going to find, but always I present all that information to them. So I think that the materials has to represent that.
Yeah. Do you find it challenging? And I don't know how often you have had the opportunity to go back home since you've been in Ohio, but do you find it challenging now that you're removed from your cultural context to keep up with that? Because I know for myself, I've lived in the States for decades now, and I don't get to travel back to Germany as often as I like to. And I feel that I'm experiencing a disconnect now between my own culture, and it's becoming more and more difficult for me to relay, I guess, authentic ways of German speech. Maybe do you find similar sentiments in your situation?
Great. So, for example, in here in the Ohio State, they provide me a great opportunity so I can go to my country every year.
Oh, nice.
So they, put all the economic funds there and everything. So they give me the opportunity to go every year to Bolivia and found new materials, books,
Mm-hmm.
texts, and bring our clothings, bring
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
elements that I was thinking about that. And also when I went there, so I try to record everything. I
Yeah.
record a lot of aspects because if you found in the internet, they are already created. They have a transcript to follow, but
Sure.
that's not something real for my students.
Yeah.
So I went there. I have a conversation with my grandmother, and she didn't notice, but I am recording what she's saying. We are bringing picture for my students, and I usually, if it is permitted, I bring a lot of stuff for doing the cooking here. At the Ohio
Mm.
State University, before the pandemic, we have a Quechua Community Day. So in the Quechua Community Day, all my students from my all institutions came and visit Ohio State, and we prepare food, Quechua food, we prepare Quechua drinks, we listen Quechua music, and
Yeah.
we invite someone that is doing, some weaving,
Mm-hmm.
that is maybe a Quechua writer, someone related to our culture, because unfortunately we cannot bring someone that easy. I'm going to bring a speaker from Bolivia to be with the students, but we found these ways for the students to practice and to listen others, and that is my objective for my advanced classes. All the material, the audio files, the works that they are doing, the reading that we are doing are not from me. because the students get used to, to my voice. They get used to my
Sure.
writing. So that's why we use others for the homeworks, for the listening part, for the writing. So we read other authors, and the students like that because they face another style of writing, another style of speaking. I think that that's also a good idea for the programs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful. I'm so glad that you have that opportunity.
What advice would you give students who want to study an indigenous language that may not be offered on their campus?
Well, I suggest that the students visit their campus, and specifically they look for the core share coordinator. Okay, they are going to find someone that is with that responsibility, that's in charge of the core share coordination, and maybe they that person that responsible is going to look for another partner institution that is teaching the indigenous or the language that they are looking for and they want to study.
Wonderful. What final piece of advice would you give to instructors who want to design materials that are culturally appropriate when source materials may not be easily available? And if they maybe cannot go to the target culture or to the target country, do you have any suggestions for where to start?
Yes, so I think that, as I maybe mentioned it before, but we already have a group of indigenous instructors here in the US, not only for Quechua, but for Aymara, for Nahuatl, for all of them. So the best opportunity here is that you could work with a instructor as a partner and invite him or her to have to create these materials, because they are here already, so they can work with you. You can invite them, you can record him or her, you can create or exchange material.
Sure.
Right, exchange material, or do it like a mobile, like material. So if the instructor has, for example, right here in the US, in the Ohio State, we have lots of clothing and books and instruments and everything. So I can lend that to Cornell, right, and for them to watch it, touch it, and see how is the clothing from Bolivia if they are learning a Quechua variant, so they can learn and see and listen, and touch this stuff, so we can share. I think that is the first step here, like create a community here in the US with instructors that are already here. And that is also the community heart, right? That is Quechua, right? That is the helping. The community always is there. So we have to promote the principles of Quechua here, the principle of indigenous people that is shared, right? That is shared.
That's
Wonderful.
beautiful. Yeah.
Well, before we sign off, we'd like to ask you to share your favorite word in a language you speak, love, or are learning. So what is that favorite word?
My favorite word in Quechua is always Ayllu. Ayllu, that means community. Without a community, there is nothing. For planting, for working, for teaching, for learning, for living, it has to be someone else. So it has to be a community. That's my favorite word.
I love that.
I
feel like that's a really important sentiment always, but now in particular, it feels poignant.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for speaking of language with us today, Elvia.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for learning and listening about indigenous language, that we are these languages that are underrepresented. We are small languages that maybe we don't have the same opportunities as other languages here in the US. Not only here in the US, but in our own countries, we don't have the same opportunities as Spanish or other languages. And thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to be in your series of presentations. And I hope that other institutions give the opportunity to other indigenous languages that are present here in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the work that you do.
No, thank you so much.
Next week, Jalen Millen will join us. She is the new Language House Director on campus, and we are excited to hear what plans she has for our favorite residential program. Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.